understanding and judging horror movies. Within the academic discussion of horror movies, more attention has been given to the first of these activities than to the second. Many explanations have been offered for what horror movies do and why, but there are fewer of how and why a horror movie might be any good. There are many possible reasons for this, from the tendency of much academic criticism to avoid overt evaluation, to the low cultural status of the horror genre, and the more anthropological approaches that this tends to attract. Another factor, however, may also be the counterintuitive dimension to the genre and its appeal. In his Philosophy of Horror, Noel Carroll observes that the horror genre gives every evidence of being pleasurable to its audience, but it does so by means of trafficking in the very sorts of things that cause disquiet, distress, and displeasure. I remember being uncomfortably aware of this back in 2007, when I went to see Hostel Part 2 at the cinema. At the climax of the film, the heroine, Beth, turns the tables on her torturer, Stuart, and castrates him. I remember urging Beth from my cinema seat to throw Stuart's severed genitals to the nearby guard dogs, and feeling some satisfaction when she did so. Afterwards, I felt a mixture of embarrassment and wonder at how the movie was able to provoke such a reaction, and how, in the moment, it felt quite reasonable. Assuming that I am not a completely lost cause, there seem to be some complex pleasures involved, requiring the temporary suspension of some values, i.e., those that hold that it is neither justified nor entertaining to castrate a man and feed his genitals to dogs, but the retention of others, like those that recognise the cruelty and misogyny in Stuart's previous treatment of Beth. My point here is to emphasise that a basic question raised by horror movies, why would someone want to watch this sort of thing, is a complex one. As such, it's easy to see why some discussions of the genre don't go beyond it. However, I would argue that maintaining too much of a separation between explanation and evaluation can be detrimental to both. This is where the work of V.F. Perkins, especially in Film as Film, is particularly valuable. The subtitle of Film as Film is, of course, Understanding and Judging Movies, and it remains one of the only major works of film theory in which evaluation is taken as seriously as explanation. Part of what I want to do in this video essay is bring a perspective influenced by Perkins into contact with some ostensibly un-Perkins films, in terms not only of the periods and genres of film that Perkins tended to write about, but also of the qualities in those films that he identified as valuable. Perkins makes it clear that the arguments in Film as Film are intended to apply to the category of the fiction movie. On the one hand, horror films fit into this category. On the other, horror is, in some respects, a distinctive subcategory within that larger grouping. Part of this distinctiveness, as I've already suggested, has to do with the deployment of controlled unpleasantness. Of course, this issue is bigger than the horror genre. Varieties of unpleasantness, for example sadness, are routinely offered for our enjoyment in different art forms. Critical interest in negative emotions in art is at least as old as Aristotle's examination of tragedy. Still, the evaluative implications of this haven't always been clear, and the quantity of examples and range of achievement in the horror genre present an opportunity to explore this further. I am also following a hunch. From my own experience, I suspect that horror movies are sometimes able to get away with certain stylistic and tonal features that might not work in many other types of movie. Whether or not this is connected to the genre's use of unpleasantness remains to be seen, but it seems a reasonable place to start. When critics and theorists have tried to address the role of unpleasantness in horror, they have rightly stressed its containment. This is implied in Carroll's term art horror, which he uses to distinguish the response sought by works of fictional horror from a horrified response to something understood as real. Our awareness of the fiction is a key factor in limiting the unpleasantness and channeling it into a different kind of experience. Isabel Pinedo stresses the importance of contained unpleasantness even more overtly through her concept of recreational terror, which she defines as a simulation of danger that produces a bounded experience of fear. Like many other writers on horror, Carroll and Pinedo are more interested in explaining its general appeal than making evaluative distinctions between different examples of the genre. However, they suggest critical possibilities that Perkins' work can help us to clarify. Art horror and recreational terror are dialectical formulations, combining two contrasting elements that complement and qualify each other. This suggests that part of what is at stake here is a kind of balance. Perkins provides a useful summary of a comparable issue. Critical and creative problems arise from the attempt to balance requirements of equal weight but divergent tendency. Returning to Pinedo's phrase, recreation and terror certainly seem like divergent tendencies. Even if their weight isn't strictly equal, it is still reasonable to assume that if both dimensions are important, the effect depends on neither overwhelming the other. Balance, of course, can be sought and achieved on many different levels. The level to which Perkins is referring is that of the medium itself, balancing the contrasting impulses, reality and illusion, fact and feeling, and so on, that characterise the impure medium of the narrative film. As Perkins puts it, the movie is committed to finding a balance between equally insistent pulls, one towards credibility, the other towards shape and significance. Perkins is also interested in more local forms of balance. However, he understands these to be connected to, and often inseparable from, the wider balance with which he is concerned. Referring to some conventional terms of negative evaluation, vacuity, sentimentality and pretension, Perkins remarks, "If I have said little in this chapter about such traditional failings, or about the traditional qualities like inventiveness, wit and economy, it is not because I think them unimportant, rather because they result from defects or achievements of balance and integration and are most clearly defined in those terms." These concerns also apply to Carroll and Pinedo's understandings of horror. Both art horror and recreational terror suggest not only balance, but a comparable kind of balance between the convincing and the significant. For an experience to be one of horror, it has to be sufficiently vivid. For an experience to be one of art horror, it has to be both vivid and appropriately structured. So far, so good. However, moving from theories of horror to individual horror movies, many of these seem to have more in common with the negative examples that Perkins offers in Film as Film, his illustrations of disproportion and failed integration. Often, this may be a matter of quality. A familiar realization for many of us who have been taught and influenced by Victor Perkins is that the standards set in his work, though reasonable and modestly articulated, are still very high, and many movies fall short of them. But there are also, I suspect, factors involved that are more specific to the horror genre. Some of the effects sought in horror movies are such that terms like balance don't seem so immediately appropriate to describing their successes or failures. We can clarify this with a couple of examples where Perkins talks about more challenging achievements of balance, where the style or the material contains pitfalls that have been skillfully avoided. Of the shower scene in Psycho, Perkins remarks that, if makeup allowed the episode to be faked as a continuous piece of realistic action, the sequence would be obscene. Connecting the music in Johnny Guitar to the film's wider approach, Perkins argues that intensification is calculated to arrive at, but not to pass the edge of absurdity. We might note that the effects that Perkins praises these films for avoiding are among those that horror films, especially since the erosion of censorship from the 1960s onwards, have pursued. I will return to obscenity shortly, but I will start with absurdity. When I think about absurdity in horror movies, I often recall a moment in Suspiria. Sarah, the main character's roommate at a ballet academy secretly run by witches, is being chased by an unseen maniac. She flees into the attic and is trapped in a room with her pursuer just outside. Sarah notices a high window and climbs through. In the next room, she jumps down into a mass of wire, where she remains painfully tangled until her still unseen pursuer arrives and kills her. The effectiveness of this moment is inseparable from its absurdity. The wire appears to cover the whole floor. It is possible to rationalise its presence in an attic room for security or maintenance purposes, but the impression created is less of a utility room than of a pit of wire whose only function is to lie in wait for unsuspecting trainee ballerinas. Perkins observes that no game worth watching changes its rules at the player's convenience. Shortly before, he also remarks that, in a fictional world where anything at all can happen, nothing at all can mean or matter. By moving the goalposts in this sequence, Dario Argento commits something close to the offences that Perkins describes. He introduces a new, impersonal threat, apparently out of nowhere. It makes very little sense for the world of the film to anticipate Sarah's flight through the window and set her a trap, but that is what seems to happen. The film appears to embrace the suggestion that anything at all can happen, and nothing at all can mean or matter, at least as a momentary passing effect, to help create a sense of pervasive menace. However, Perkins reminds us that the created world must obey its own logic. There is no pretext, whether it be significance, effect, or the happy ending, sufficient to justify a betrayal of the given order. Rather than undermining the logic of its fictional world, however, I would argue that this sequence in Suspiria helps to reveal that logic. In Argento's films, it can be difficult to distinguish between absurdity as an aesthetic effect and as a product of perfunctory storytelling. In this case, however, I am confident that it is an aesthetic effect, and a successful one at that. The scene's narrative absurdity is supported by a formal coherence. Choices in composition, cinematography, and editing combine to reinforce the sense of a sudden and extreme departure from the logic of the preceding chase. The duration of the sequence reinforces the sense of the absurd. Sarah struggles in the wire for almost a minute before her killer arrives. The door is visible most of the time, but stubbornly out of reach. Sarah is trapped, and our viewpoint seems trapped there with her. The space beyond the room feels remote, almost abstract. The killer's entry is marked by Sarah's reaction, but we neither see nor hear the door open. There is no change of lighting either, despite the contrast between the deep blue of the room and the yellow-brown light outside. For an extended moment, this contained space dominates the film. It is as if the whole of the movie's world, as far as it is accessible to us, has been temporarily lined with wire. Perkins argues that the meanings which are contained most securely within a film are those formed at the deepest level of interrelation and synthesis. As the sequence in Suspiria partly relies on its disconnection from the preceding film, there are forms of interrelation that are simply not available to it. It cannot, for example, form part of a careful, consistently developing pattern. Nonetheless, the level of internal synthesis achieved within the scene is impressive. Argento is deceptively rigorous in establishing that the rules have changed, and that such changes might themselves be a feature of the film's wider world. Horror offers more scope than most other genres for the embracing of irrationality. One direction in which its conventional material can be taken is toward chaos, and this can involve sacrificing forms of narrative, stylistic, and logical balance. Horror movies can build towards a surrender to irrationality, an acknowledgement of the terrible absurdity of what has been depicted. The endings of three great horror movies, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Witchfinder General, and Argento's Tenebrae, all feature a character screaming uncontrollably. This may be the movies literalizing the type of reaction they aim to provoke. It may also be a recognition of one of the few appropriate reactions that remain to the world that we have been shown. We might observe distinct but related refusals of balance or coherence in other recurring horror endings, including sequences that are shown or suggested to be dreams, as in Carrie, Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and so on, or the large-scale destruction of the setting, an ending used in several Stephen King novels. But now, onto the obscene. I take it that Perkins is arguing that Psycho avoids excessive explicitness of violence and nudity, and the troubling implications of the two together. Again, however, an explicitness that goes too far, or further than expected, has become another recognised effect in the horror repertoire. The impact of the man's head exploding early in Scanners depends on its abrupt and extreme shift in register. The construction of the sequence, the intercutting of close-ups, the rising pitch and volume of the music, the increasing discomfort displayed during an apparently controlled corporate demonstration, suggests that it's building towards a climax. However, for the demonstrator's head to be replaced in an instant with what might be described as a cloud of meat is an escalation out of proportion with anything in the preceding film. The sequence combines the shock of the sudden with a level of explicitness that goes beyond what may be conventionally expected. Head explosions and equivalent displays of gore remain relatively uncommon in mainstream movies. In the shower scene in Psycho, Perkins argues, an extreme of intellectual and emotional shock is conveyed without provoking physical revulsion, which would detach us from the film. The head explosion in Scanners makes no attempt to avoid physical revulsion, but instead uses it as part of the shock. The achievement of the scene is one of contrast between the initially bland and unremarkable situation and the bloody eruption that follows. The death of the demonstrator is less of a narrative shock than the famous surprise in Psycho, but it is given its own force by the suddenness of the change and the deliberate extremity of what is introduced. When I was discussing the absurdity of the Suspiria moment, I couldn't get far without also mentioning its apparent gratuitousness. As my example from Scanners also suggests, the two effects are interconnected. The sequence in Suspiria also relies on rapid escalation as Sarah moves from fleeing a malevolent individual to inhabiting a malevolent environment. It is inadvisable to try to define horror in too singular or comprehensive terms. However, my version of such a definition might include something like an interest in going beyond certain conventionally defined limits. Carol Clover's description of slasher films, drenched in taboo and encroaching vigorously on the pornographic, suggests a wider conception of what horror movies often do, and sometimes do well. Many of the more effective horror films demonstrate how encroaching vigorously on various conventional limits can be a source of dynamic energy. While I wouldn't want to rely too heavily on this as a defining feature, its ability to suggest connections between otherwise disparate parts of the horror genre is a point in its favour. It helps to clarify, for example, what the explicit depiction of violence in post-Psycho horror movies has in common with the weird fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, with its interest in the unfathomable and the unutterable. I have deliberately avoided words like transgression and excess. Some of the theoretical connotations that these terms have acquired might push my point in an unintended direction. For example, there is a tradition, rooted in structuralism, of treating excess as a byproduct of narrative and ideological systems, the elements unaccounted for when everything else lines up. However, some valuable and relevant perspectives have developed out of this conception. For example, Linda Williams rightly questions the excessiveness of excess in what she calls body genres, including horror, if such effects are intrinsic to these genres' conventional experiences. It is important to acknowledge that horror offers us a conventionalized version of excess. However, this does not mean that we should treat excess as having a defined and predictable significance in horror contexts. This doesn't leave much room for distinguishing more or less successful instances. Treating excess as an aesthetic strategy involves recognizing that it is always defined in relative terms. Genre conventions are an important context for this, so following Williams, we shouldn't be surprised, say, that a horror movie contains explicit violence. However, even within such contexts, the effectiveness or interest of particular moments often depends on going beyond what might be immediately expected. Some expectations will be social or cultural, values, taboos, and so on. Others will be more localized, defined by the film. Perkins' work helps us to recognize some of the key considerations involved. At the wider level, he reminds us that a film draws non-stop on the values and knowledge which we bring to it. The shared standards and associations to which a film appeals form part of the basis for any kind of significance, whether this involves exceeding conventional limitations or remaining within them. If we could rid ourselves of knowledge and our customary patterns of thought, we could not make sense of a movie. This essential frame of reference, though obvious, can easily be taken for granted or reduced to some of the more specific ideologies that it might encompass. At the more local level of significance, Perkins emphasises the importance of the surrounding film in our experience of its individual components. A fast camera movement will claim most in a predominantly static movie. A big close-up will hit hardest in a picture mainly composed of more distant images. Elsewhere in Film as Film, he ends a similar point about Psycho by declaring that film is a matter of relationships. The rather un-Perkins-like exclamation mark seems to emphasise how central this summary is to the argument in Film as Film. While I stand by my claim that they rely on forms of imbalance or disproportion, the horror movie moments I've discussed are successful only as parts of a wider design. The sudden change in direction in Suspiria depends on the preceding moments being recognisable as a conventional chase sequence. It is also one of a series of descents into chaos around which the film is structured. The head explosion in Scanners achieves its effects in relation to the immediate situation, a supposedly safe and contained formal demonstration to an auditorium of businessmen and women, and to the developing scales of explicitness and intensity in the early stages of the movie. It has not been my intention to dismiss the criterion of balance, but rather to emphasise that, in certain contexts, its operations can be complicated or indirect. Balance can be suspended on one level, but perhaps offset by different forms of balance at other levels. The importance of this can be clearest when these other levels are inadequate or missing, as they are for the dream, hallucination, ritual sequences in the British horror movie The Curse of the Crimson Altar. No clear or satisfactory relationship is established between these sequences, with their lighting and sound effects, kaleidoscopic images and fetishistic costumes, and the rest of the film. Their incongruity could be made purposeful, as I would argue that it is in my examples from Suspiria and Scanners, but it isn't, leaving the scenes feeling like unanchored excursions into psychedelic nonsense. I have argued that, when analysing and evaluating horror movies, considerations sometimes apply that might not apply elsewhere. Put that way, this isn't controversial. At the same time, it is also important to avoid making too special a case of the genre. In most horror movies, most of the time, the criteria that Perkins emphasises, balance, coherence, and others, are as relevant to the judgment of success and failure as they are to the examples in Film as Film or anywhere else. When preparing the original paper on which this video essay is based, I watched the Australian film Patrick and the Japanese film Dark Water in close succession, and noted that the more obvious horror moments actually accounted for only a small proportion of each film. Both movies devote much of their running times to the more everyday story of a woman going through a difficult divorce. It is appropriate to assess long stretches of these and other horror films just as we would material from any other genre. Then again, as Perkins' work reminds us, the different components of these movies are not insulated from one another. Our experience of the overtly horrific segments will shape our experience of the material in which they are embedded, and vice versa. Film is a matter of relationships! Exclamation mark.